Thank you very much, Las Cian Corla. And thank you, Minister, for taking this debate. I'm sharing my time with Deputy McGrath. So there are a number of issues, Minister, in relation to this. And the first and most important issue, I think, is in relation to open disclosure. And of course, mandatory open disclosure is now going to be part of the Patient Safety Bill, which will be coming to the Health Committee for pre-legislative scrutiny next Wednesday. I think that's going to be a very important meeting in relation to defining open disclosure. But in relation to cervical check, and in any way trying to explain what happened, there is a difference between organisational open disclosure and individual open disclosure. And I think what happened in cervical check, the lines of responsibility on disclosure was blurred, and they should have been clarified and they should have been quickly identified. And I think the failure to not identify the lack of open disclosure in cervical check was because there wasn't independent oversight of the scheme, and there wasn't patient advocates sitting on the structures of cervical check who would have spotted this difficulty very early on. Because when you open disclose an incident, it usually is contemporaneously. Something has happened and within a few days it has been identified that there's been a problem and you open disclose. But in relation to cervical check, this was referring to historical events that had happened several years earlier, and cervical check failed to identify the difficulties that was going to pose and identify who was to be the responsible person in relation to disclosure. And that has led to the failure here. So the difficulty also was in relation to disclosing to women, but also the communication gaps that developed within cervical check in relation to where the lines of responsibility lay. And of course the appalling shortcomings in the manner in which disclosure was eventually made when the scandal broke. It was rushed, it was ham-fisted and very amateurish, and it did not, I must say, reflect on the medical profession very well. The second point is cervical check. Dr. Scally identified it as a dysfunctional organisation, that it lacked governance and it lacked accountability, that there was no clear responsibility among the various sectors in cervical check, and there was no clear job description. So there was a lack of clarity on how people should function within the system, and in particular how information was transmitted up and down the line. So Dr. Scally identified a whole of systems failure, and he was restrained in identifying particular individuals. And if particular individuals are to be found wanting, I have no problem with that. But the blurredness in relation to the organisation, governance and accountability of cervical check makes that very difficult. So there was nobody in charge. There was an absence of governance, and there was poor oversight by the HSE. So there is an absolute urgency in reinstating the HSE board, and I know that the HSE governance bill is also going to come before the Dáil very soon. And I think it's absolutely essential that we have a reorganised, slimmed down, very clear governance structure within the HSE, and that just not the HSE board, but going right down through the organisation. And I think when we do talk about Sláinte Care report, and it is a substantial part of Sláinte Care report, that there has to be huge governance reform within the HSE. And I know we have spoken about that on many occasions, Minister, so I won't go into it again. There is a necessity for no-fault compensation in relation to what happened. I think to have women go through the adversarial court system, as we've seen Vicky Phelan and Emma Vic Mahuna and others go through the adversarial system, it's not fair, because you are talking about dealing with people who have offered themselves voluntarily, who are perfectly healthy when they go for screening, in the same way that when children present for vaccination, they're perfectly healthy children. And if there is if they suffer an injury, whatever the case may be, there should be no fault compensation. They should not have to go through the adversarial system. And I know Judge Meehan is going to report on alternative methods, but I think we do have to look at how we deal with people who are injured by our health system, and they should not have to go through the adversarial system. And again, I think Gabriel Scally identifies that. Another aspect of the report is data sharing, and there was a breakdown in data sharing, and that the National Cancer Registry and cervical screening had different lists of people who had cervical cancer, and they weren't sharing that information between each other. And even the gathering of data was a problem in relation to cervical check, and I think the gathering of data is a big problem in relation to the health service in general. And again, we discussed that briefly at our health committee meeting this morning. Without data, and data is king, without data you cannot plan a health service, and I think that was a deficiency within cervical check. I'll just quote a journalist to finish who wrote about this during the week. And he said the shortcomings of cervical check was a whole of system failure, a wider failure within the health service, where the welfare of patients got lost in the political and bureaucratic manoeuvrings operating in a cocoon of detachment. And I think that summarises what happened here. There was no outside vigilance on what was happening within cervical screening, and people got locked into a bubble and they weren't thinking properly, and they were not putting the patient at the centre of the service. And that is so important, that whatever service we provide, that we put the patient at the centre. And that's why it's so important that we do have 2 patient advocates on the HSE board, and we should have 2 patient advocates on every board, whether it's a local or regional or a national level, to make sure that this does not happen again. Thank you.